The wind changed direction at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Eleanor Voss felt it before she heard it. She was crouched over a snare line a mile and a half northeast of Harrow Creek, her fingers working the wire loop with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this same task 1,000 times in 1,000 different weathers. The January sky had been the color of old pewter all morning, heavy and still in the way that winter skies sometimes go still before they stop being still altogether. She had noted it when she left the bluff at dawn. She had filed it away in the part of her mind that never stopped watching. But it was the change in the wind that made her stop, not the cold. Cold was a constant in Wyoming in January, as reliable as the sun and far less welcome. What made Eleanor Voss set down her work and rise slowly to her full height was something subtler than temperature. The air had been pressing from the northwest and all morning, steady and dry, carrying the faint mineral scent of the high plains. Then in the span of perhaps 3 seconds, it shifted. The pressure dropped. The scent changed to something deeper, something that had no name in ordinary language, but that Eleanor's body recognized the way a body recognizes the smell of smoke before the eyes find the fire. She straightened up and looked northwest. The sky in that direction had gone the color of a bruise, not gray, not even the deep slate of an ordinary storm front. This was purple, the specific shade of purple that Eleanor had seen exactly once before in her life, on a morning in February of 1879 on the open Dakota plain, when she had been 43 years old and still had a husband and a daughter, and a life that looked the way lives are supposed to look. She did not run immediately. She knelt down first, pressed her palm flat against the frozen ground, and held it there. People who witnessed this habit of hers, and some people in Harrow Creek, had witnessed it from a distance, over the years generally took it as confirmation of what they already believed about her. She was eccentric. She was touched. She was the widow woman from Raven Bluff who talked to rocks. What she was actually doing was listening. The ground carried information that the air could not. Vibration moved through frozen earth in advance of the disturbance that created it, the way a railroad worker presses his ear to the rail to hear a coming train long before it appears on the horizon. Eleanor had learned this not from any book, but from 7 years of solitary observation, from seasons of pressing her hand to the cold ground in all conditions, and noting what she felt against what she later saw. The earth beneath her palm was trembling in a particular way, a deep, sustained shiver that she had cataloged carefully in the pages of a small leather notebook back at her shelter. She had only felt that specific tremor twice before. The first time a blizzard had buried Harrow Creek under 4 feet of snow and killed 11 cattle in a single night. She stood up, left the snare where it was, and turned toward the bluff. Half a mile to her south, barely visible against the pale winter landscape, a rider moved along the northern road at a steady trot. Even at that distance, Eleanor recognized the bay horse and the broad-shouldered set of the man in the saddle. Sheriff Caleb Rourke making his afternoon circuit of the valley roads. A reliable man in most respects. Reliable in his rounds, reliable in his opinions, reliable in his certainty that the world worked in the ways he believed it worked and not in any other way. She watched him for a moment. He was heading east away from the coming front, his attention on the road ahead. He would not look northwest. Men like Rourke surveyed the horizon for threats they already knew to recognize: strangers on the road, damaged fences, signs of trouble in the forms trouble had taken before. They did not generally kneel in frozen fields and press their hands to the ground to hear what was coming. Then Rourke turned his head and looked directly at her. Even at that distance, she could read the small, dismissive tilt of his chin. She had seen it before on his face and on the faces of most of the men in Harrow Creek, a gesture so habitual they probably did not know they were making it. He saw a gray-haired woman crouching in a field, and he saw what he expected to see, the widow Voss doing something peculiar, as she was generally understood to do. He turned away and rode on. The purple sky advanced behind him without hurry, the way things advance when they do not need to be in a hurry, because they cannot be stopped. Eleanor started walking faster. She was not afraid, almost. Fear was a response she had trained herself to work around rather than through, in the same way she had trained herself to work through cold, through exhaustion, through the kind of silence that falls in a place after something terrible has happened. What she felt as she turned toward Raven Bluff was closer to clarity. The world had sharpened to its necessary edges the way it always did when it was about to demand something from her. She was thinking about wood, about how much she had stacked against the eastern wall and whether it was enough, about the tin of rendered lard and the salt she had laid in before Christmas, and the barrels of dried corn and the sacks of flour she had bought from Thomas Greer's store in November, overpaying for the privilege, tolerating the look on Greer's face that said he was already composing the story he would tell about her at the counter the next morning, about the groundwater seep in the back chamber and whether the pipe she had hammered into the rock face was still drawing clean. She was thinking about whether she had done enough. She had been asking herself that question for 7 years. The answer, as always, was the same. She had done what she could do. She had done it alone, without help, without approval, without anyone in the county of Harrow Creek bothering to understand why a 50-year-old widow woman had spent the better part of 3 years buying tools, hauling timber, and disappearing into the side of a basalt hill. She had done it because she had learned at a cost that could not be calculated in any currency that the difference between living and dying in this country often came down to a distance of 18 feet. She did not let herself think about that number too long. It had a weight to it that could stop her moving if she held it too long in her mind. She let it pass through the way she let most things pass through now, and she kept walking. The wind shifted again behind her harder this time, and she heard the first low groan of the storm coming down off the mountains. She started to run. The day Eleanor Voss became who she was had begun like 100 other days on the Dakota Plain, ordinary in the way that catastrophic days often are, ordinary right up to the moment they stop being ordinary. February 1879. She had been 43 years old and part of a wagon caravan of 58 settlers moving west from Illinois. Her husband, Nathaniel, was 46, a carpenter by trade and a farmer by intention, a large, quiet man who thought carefully before he spoke, and who, when he did speak, generally said something worth hearing. Their daughter, Clarissa, was 19, possessed of the specific brand of hopeful energy that belongs to the young before the world has had enough time to complicate it. Eleanor had been the group's medical resource for most of the journey, her hands steady and her manner calm, in the way that 7 years of working in field hospitals during the war had left her calm. She was not the kind of woman who frightened easily. She was, however, the kind of woman who paid attention to the sky. The morning of the storm, she had found the caravan's leader at the lead wagon, running his hands over a harness strap that did not need adjustment. Harold Beecham was 55 years old, built like a draft horse, and carried 20 years of overland experience on him, the way other men carry pocket watches, not as a tool exactly, but as a constant reminder of their own authority. He had guided parties from Illinois to Wyoming 6 times without losing a person, a fact he found occasion to mention with some regularity. Eleanor stood beside him and looked at the western sky. The clouds had the wrong texture, not the deep rolling cumulus of a building storm, but something flatter and faster, moving with the kind of urgency that meant the cold air behind it was moving faster still. "We should stop," she said. "Make camp here and wait it out. The pressure has been dropping since before dawn." Beecham looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who had heard many things in his life and sorted them rapidly into 2 categories: things that came from sources he respected and things that did not. Eleanor knew which category she occupied without needing to be told. "Pressure," he repeated. "The air, the weight of it. When it drops like this, a hard front is coming. Mrs. Voss." He said her name with a particular kind of patience, the patience a large man uses when he is explaining something to someone he considers smaller, and he said it loudly enough that the men checking their own harnesses nearby could hear. "I have crossed this territory 6 times. I have read this sky more times than I can count. This is a cold snap moving through. We push on." Someone laughed. She did not look to see who. She looked at Nathaniel, who was standing near the second wagon with his hands in his coat pockets. He met her eyes. He did not laugh. But he also did not step forward, did not say the thing that might have been said, did not add his weight to hers in the way that a man standing beside his wife might add his weight. It was a small thing. She knew that. He was not a man who humiliated his wife, not a man who dismissed her, not a man who thought her foolish. He simply did not want a conflict with Beecham, not in front of the group, not on a cold morning when everyone was tired and wanted to move. It was a small failure of a very ordinary human kind, and she understood it, and she never blamed him for it. But she remembered it, the way the body remembers small injuries without being asked to. The sky turned inside out approximately 4 hours later. There was no gradual onset. One moment the world was gray and cold and incomprehensible. The next it was white. Not white like snow is ordinarily white, but white like the absence of all other information, like the world had simply stopped producing visual data and replaced everything with static. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in less time than it takes to lace a boot. The wind came in at a horizontal angle with enough force to knock a standing person sideways, and it carried inside it particles of ice that moved at speeds that could strip skin. Eleanor had been near the back of the caravan when it happened. She had heard the shouts ahead, heard the horses scream, and then there was nothing but the white noise of the storm and the wind and the sensation of something enormous pressing down on everything. She fought her way off the road by instinct, moving perpendicular to the wind, because moving into it was impossible, keeping low, finding what footing she could in the churned snow. She found the rock by her hands, not her eyes. A face of basalt pushing out of the frozen ground at an angle, and behind it a seam, a crack in the stone wide enough to wedge herself into, deep enough to break the wind, and she went in. For 15 minutes she heard them. Nathaniel's voice first, a long calling of her name, that the wind pulled apart and reassembled in fragments. Then Clarissa's voice higher, more frightened, and then both together, and she crawled toward the sound. She pressed out of the seam and crawled across the frozen ground toward her family's voices, and the wind drove ice into her eyes, and she could not see, and she could not breathe. And then she hit the rock face again, and there was nothing to do but go back inside and hold on. When the storm broke 3 hours after it had begun, Eleanor climbed out into a world that looked like it had been turned over and emptied. 39 of the 58 people in the caravan had died. Most of them were found in clusters huddled together, which had slowed their dying but had not prevented it. Nathaniel and Clarissa were found 18 feet from the rock seam where Eleanor had survived. 18 feet. She measured it herself later when she could make her hands hold a length of rope without shaking. She measured it, and then she measured it again, because the first measurement seemed too cruel to be accurate, and she needed to be certain. It was accurate. 18 feet was the distance between the place where she had heard their voices and the place where the cold had reached them. 18 feet in conditions of zero visibility was an uncrossable distance. Harold Beecham was found alive 40 yards from the wreckage of the lead wagon, standing next to the body of his horse. He was crying. She could hear him from where she stood with the rope in her hands. He was a large man, and he was crying in the helpless way of someone experiencing a grief he had not been built to carry. And Eleanor stood in the snow and looked at him and understood something she had not understood before. She had been angry in the first minutes after finding Nathaniel and Clarissa. She had expected the anger to be directed at Beecham, and some of it was, and she knew that some of it always would be. But standing there watching him cry, she understood that Harold Beecham was not a villain. He was not cruel, not malicious, not even particularly reckless by the standards of men who led wagon trains across difficult country. He was simply a man who had never been wrong about the sky, not in 20 years, and who therefore had no frame of reference for the possibility that he could be wrong about the sky. He had not dismissed her warning out of contempt. He had dismissed it out of a bedrock certainty in his own experience that was so deep he could not see around it. That kind of certainty, she understood, standing in the snow with the rope in her hands, was more dangerous than malice. Malice you could fight. You could argue against it, expose it, resist it. But a man who is simply certain, who has earned his certainty through decades of not being wrong, cannot be reached by argument. He can only be reached by consequence. She turned away from Beecham and began walking. There was nothing else to do. She had already learned the only lesson the day had to teach, and she did not need to stand in the cold any longer to complete the education. From that day forward, Eleanor Voss trusted stone more than she trusted anything that moved. She spent 3 years in the town of Fort Laramie working as a medical attendant at the garrison there, saving what she could. Sleeping in a small room behind the infirmary, eating little, spending almost nothing. By 1882, she had enough to purchase land in Wyoming, and she looked for land the way she looked for everything after 1879, with the specific question of what it could shelter. The 35 acres she bought east of Harrow Creek were by any conventional measure worthless. The soil was basalt heavy and shallow, unsuitable for farming. There was no water source on the surface. The terrain was broken and uneven, pitched toward a bluff on the eastern edge that caught wind from every direction in summer and delivered it at full strength. No one had built on it. No one had wanted to. Eleanor had walked every foot of it before she signed the deed. What the land had, if you knew to look for it, was a formation of basalt along the south face of the bluff that contained a series of natural chambers carved by ancient groundwater rooms of stone that maintained a steady temperature year-round because the earth at that depth does not surrender its heat to winter. She had tested it methodically. The ambient temperature in the largest chamber held between 48 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit every day. She recorded it even in January, even in the deep cold weeks. The rock absorbed the day's limited warmth and released it slowly through the night, a thermal mass working on geological time, indifferent to weather and seasons and the ambitions of settlers who thought civilization meant building tall. The bluff itself faced south and angled slightly to deflect northerly wind rather than receive it. She had noted the wind patterns for a full season before she bought watching how the gusts moved around the formation, how the south face stayed calmer than the plain below it, even on the worst days. She moved in during the spring of 1882, carrying what she owned in 2 trips from the cart she had hired in town, and she began to work. The natural chambers needed widening. She worked with a hand drill and chisels she had bought in Cheyenne, expanding the largest room to approximately 20 feet by 18, a space large enough to move in comfortably and to store what she intended to store. She reinforced the ceiling with timber beams hauled up from the valley floor, 6 of them notched and fitted with wedges to transfer load into the rock walls rather than holding it themselves. She shaped ventilation shafts at angles that would carry smoke upward and outward without allowing wind or snow to drive back in. She laid the floor with a slight grade toward a drainage channel she cut along the western wall so that any water intrusion would run out rather than pool. She built the door from 2-inch planking, hung it on iron pintles. She forged herself over a portable forge during the first winter and sealed the frame with strips of canvas treated with linseed oil. She carved storage shelves into the soft interior walls of the secondary chamber and lined them with timber. She located the groundwater seep in the back chamber and drove a copper pipe into the rock face to direct its flow to a holding basin she chipped out of the floor. Then she stocked it. Dried corn in sealed barrels, salt pork wrapped in cloth and packed in cool sand, flour in canvas sacks triple-tied against moisture, hard cheese, dried beans, rendered lard, wood split and stacked to the ceiling of the side chamber, enough for 6 weeks of controlled burning. An iron stove small enough to be carried, but efficient enough to heat the main chamber. A medical kit she had assembled over years containing everything she had learned to need in the field: willow bark, clean bandaging, a suture kit, carbolic acid, laudanum for the worst cases. She did all of this before dawn, when she could, or after dark, or on days when the weather was bad enough that the people of Harrow Creek stayed indoors. Not because she was ashamed of what she was doing. She was not ashamed of it. She did it quietly because she had already learned in the first weeks after she moved to the Bluff that an audience asked questions and offered opinions and required management, and she did not have energy to spare for management. The opinions reached her anyway. Harrow Creek was not a large town. It had a general store, a church, a livery, a small hotel, a sheriff's office, a one-room schoolhouse, and perhaps 200 residents who knew each other's business with the thoroughness that isolation produces. Eleanor had arrived without a husband and without family connections and with a property purchase that struck everyone who heard about it as evidence of either extreme poverty or extreme eccentricity, and within a month the town had reached a consensus. She was the widow woman from the Bluff. She was peculiar. Her home was depending on who you asked a disgrace, a curiosity, or proof of mental instability. The children called it Big Grave. They dared each other to run close to the entrance and then back again at speed, shrieking with the particular delight of children, terrifying themselves with something safely distant. The adults were less playful about it. Sheriff Caleb Rourke rode up to Raven Bluff on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1883, about a year after Eleanor had moved in. He came alone, which she noted, and he dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man who had decided to have a conversation that he was not entirely looking forward to. He was 46 years old, built solidly, with a weathered face and gray eyes that were more intelligent than his certainties generally gave them opportunity to show. He had been sheriff of Harrow Creek for 11 years. He wore that tenure the way Beecham had worn his 20 years on the trail. He looked at the entrance to her shelter for a long moment before he spoke. The entrance was a low opening set into the hillside, framed in timber, partially screened by the brushy growth Eleanor had allowed to remain in front of it. It did not look like a house. It looked like what it was, a seam in the earth that a person had made inhabitable. "I understand you're living in there," Rourke said. "I am. Through the winters. That's generally when living arrangements matter most." He looked at her and she looked back. He was not a man who was easily read, but she could read the specific texture of his certainty because she had been reading that same certainty on the faces of men in authority since she was young enough to have learned what it looked like. "I've seen people freeze to death in this territory," he said. I've pulled bodies out of snowdrifts that were not 50 yards from their own front doors. The kind of shelter that keeps a person alive in real cold is a solid structure, a real foundation, a stove you can run at full heat without worrying about your roof. What you've got here is a hole in the ground. What I have here, Eleanor said, is a hole in the ground that stays 48 degrees in January without any fire at all. He blinked once. She could see the information land, and she could see it fail to dislodge the larger architecture of his thinking because a single fact rarely dislodges an architecture. It plants a small crack, and the crack may widen over time, but the building stands while it decides. That may be, he said, but no sensible person builds a life underground. Sheriff, she kept her voice even, not because she was not angry, but because anger would cost her the clarity she needed for the next sentence. How many people have you seen die in this territory because they stood out in the open trying to fight weather that couldn't be fought? How many of them died brave and upright and frozen? Because I was at Dakota in February of 1879, and I counted 39. He said nothing. 39 people died upright, she said. I survived in a crack in the ground. You can decide which approach you prefer, but I have already made my decision. Rourke stood there for another long moment, long enough that Eleanor could hear the wind working through the scrub brush below the bluff. Then he did something she had not expected. He did not leave. He stood on the hillside and looked at her shelter for another full minute, not with the dismissive tilt he had used from the road, but with something different. It was the look of a man who had been handed a piece of information that he did not know what to do with yet. He put his boot in the stirrup and mounted his horse. You'll stay inside when a serious storm comes, he said. It came out somewhere between a command and a question. That is precisely what I intend to do, Eleanor said. He rode back down this bluff without further comment. She watched him go, and she noticed the thing she had noticed in his face before he turned away, that look of unfinished calculation, and she filed it away in the same part of her mind where she kept everything she did not yet know what to do with. The more direct opposition came later that same autumn, in a form she had not entirely anticipated. Mayor Douglas Hatch called a public meeting at the town hall on a Thursday evening in October. The posted notice said the meeting was to discuss matters of community appearance and standards. And Eleanor did not see the notice until 2 days before the meeting when Owen Price mentioned it to her while he was helping her move a timber beam up the bluff. Owen was 17, the son of the town's blacksmith, and he had taken to appearing at Raven Bluff with the persistence of a stray cat that has decided it lives somewhere regardless of what the occupants of that somewhere think about it. Eleanor had attempted to discourage him 4 times. He had returned each time with a new question and on the third visit with bread. She went to the meeting. Hatch was a self-made man in the full sense of the phrase, meaning he had come to Harrow Creek with nothing and had built something from it through genuine work and genuine intelligence. He was 52, broad across the shoulders with a mayor's instinct for public performance and a businessman's instinct for calculating costs. He ran the meeting with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms that deferred to him, and when Eleanor walked through the door in the middle of his opening remarks, the room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when they encounter something unexpected. She let him finish his remarks before she stood. She had brought the paper from her coat pocket, and she laid it on the table in front of her. It was a single sheet covered in her close, careful handwriting. 39 names, she said before Hatch could respond to her standing. These are the people who died on the Dakota Plain in the blizzard of February 1879. I knew 31 of them. 39 people died in the open that day. I did not. She looked at Hatch directly. You are concerned about what newcomers will think when they see my home. I am concerned about what the next blizzard will do to people who have no shelter that can hold against it. I would ask the mayor which concern he believes the territory's next dead will find more relevant. The room was very quiet. Hatch approved the building permit at the close of the meeting. He added a single condition: the structure could not be visible from the main road into town. Eleanor took the paper and read the condition. She looked up at Hatch, and he met her gaze with the expression of a man who has made a pragmatic concession and wants it understood that this is not the same as admitting error. She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. She was nearly at the door when she heard a voice at her elbow, quiet enough that no one else could hear it. She turned. Margaret Hatch stood close beside her, the mayor's wife, a woman of 48, with fine-boned features and careful posture, and eyes that had seen considerably more than her public manner indicated. My husband is not a bad man, Margaret said. She was looking at the door rather than at Eleanor. He is afraid of being wrong. Men like him, when they've built everything themselves from nothing, the thing they cannot afford is to have been wrong. It would undo too much. She paused. He has been talking about you for 2 years. People who don't concern him don't get talked about. Eleanor looked at her. That isn't comfort, Margaret said. "Oh, I know that. I just thought you should know what you're actually dealing with." She moved away before Eleanor could respond, rejoining her husband near the front of the room with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years moving between public and private selves without showing the seam. Eleanor walked out into the cold night air and looked up at the sky, which was clear and dense with stars and giving nothing away. She stood there for a moment, turning over what Margaret had said, and found that it did not change anything practical. She still had her permit. She still had her shelter. She still had work to do. But it did something to the texture of her solitude to know that somewhere in that town, in that house, a woman had seen her clearly and had thought the seeing was worth a quiet word. She walked home to the Bluff. 3 years passed. She stocked and reinforced and prepared. She filled the pages of her leather notebook with temperatures and wind observations and calculations. Owen Price appeared regularly enough that she stopped making a show of not expecting him, and she let him help with the things that were genuinely easier with 2 pairs of hands, and she answered his questions when the answers were worth giving, and she sent him home before dark. She heard the town's opinions of her work through Owen, through the occasional words of the few people who did not actively avoid her, through the simple osmosis of living near a community too small to keep anything fully private. She heard about Thomas Greer charging her more at the store and then describing her purchases to his customers as evidence of various things, mostly her instability. She heard about the children's game at the entrance to her shelter. She heard about Reverend Cobb's sermon on the dangers of isolation and self-reliance taken to ungodly extremes, which everyone in town understood was directed at her without her name being said. She heard all of it. She continued working. On the morning of January 17, 1886, Eleanor left Raven Bluff at first light to check her snare lines. She noted the sky and the pressure. She noted the particular way the horses in the valley below were moving tight-grouped, shifting direction, frequently the behavior of animals that sense what is coming before it arrives. She noted all of it the way she noted everything, and she walked out across the frozen ground with her wire and her tools, and she did her work, and she watched the northwest horizon. When the wind shifted, she rose and turned for home. She had covered perhaps 3/4 of a mile when she saw the shape in the field to her left. Small, dark against the snow, motionless in a way that was not the motionlessness of an animal at rest, but the motionlessness of something that had stopped moving because it had run out of direction. Lily Anders was 7 years old, the middle child of Jonas and Ruth Anders, who lived on the far side of the creek and who, where Eleanor knew, the kind of family that kept poor track of its children's whereabouts on ordinary days. The child was standing in the middle of an open field, with her coat half buttoned and her face wet with crying, and frozen, looking in all directions with the specific despair of someone who has lost the landmarks they were using to navigate. Eleanor stopped. She looked at Raven Bluff, maybe 3/4 of a mile away. She looked at the sky to the northwest, where the purple had deepened to something almost black at the horizon and was moving faster than she had estimated. She looked at the child. 3 seconds. She turned and ran toward Lily. She covered the distance in less than a minute, scooped the child up without breaking stride, and shifted direction back toward the bluff. Lily was too frightened to cry anymore. She gripped Eleanor's coat with both hands and pressed her face against Eleanor's shoulder and made no sound. Eleanor ran. The wind hit them 2 minutes from the entrance. It did not build. It arrived all at once the way it had in 1879, as if the air itself had been held back by some enormous pressure and had finally found release. The temperature dropped so sharply, Eleanor felt it as a physical blow across the face. The snow came in horizontal sheets that stripped visibility down to perhaps 6 feet in the first 30 seconds. She did not stop. She knew the ground. She had walked this approach to the bluff hundreds of times in every condition, and her feet knew the small rises and the one rocky patch, and the place where the ground dipped left before the final rise to the entrance. She ran by memory and by the angle of the wind and by the orientation of her own body in space, which 7 years of solitary navigation had made precise. The brush that screened the entrance materialized out of the white exactly where it was supposed to be. She pushed through it. Her hand found the door. She pulled it open and went through and pulled it shut behind her, and the sound of the storm went from everything to almost nothing in the space of a single step. Lily Anders lifted her face from Eleanor's shoulder and looked around. The lamp was on its shelf beside the door. Eleanor lit it with hands that were cold but steady, and the light spread across the carved shelves, the stacked wood, the barrels and sacks, in carefully ordered supplies of a person who had been preparing for this day since long before this day had a name. The child looked at all of it for a long time. "You knew they were going to come," Lily said. It was not quite a question. "All the people, you knew they would come here." Eleanor set the child down on the sleeping platform and wrapped a blanket around her small shoulders. Outside, the storm was deepening towards something neither of them could see yet. It was hitting the bluff the way it always hit things. It wanted to move with a low, sustained force that sounded when you were inside the stone, less like wind and more like the earth itself changing its mind about something. Eleanor sat down beside the child. She put her hand flat against the cold wall and felt the rock hold steady beneath her palm. "I didn't know," she said. "I prepared like they would." The first knock came at 20 minutes past 7. Eleanor knew because she had been watching the small brass clock on the carved shelf above the stove, tracking it the way a field surgeon tracks the time between a wound and a death. Not with dread, but with the knowledge that time is the variable, everything else runs on. She had been inside for less than 2 hours. Lily Anders had stopped shaking and fallen into the deep, boneless sleep of a child whose body has decided that consciousness is no longer required. Eleanor had fed the stove carefully, bringing the main chamber up to a temperature that would sustain life without burning through wood at a rate she could not afford, and she had done a full inventory by lamplight, moving through each chamber with her notebook open, recording what she had against what she might need, calculating the math of survival the way she had once calculated the math of blood loss and available bandaging. She was not prepared for 32 people. She had prepared for 15, possibly 18. The inventory had been built around a maximum of 15 with enough margin to absorb 2 or 3 unexpected arrivals. She had not seriously considered the possibility that a substantial portion of Harrow Creek's population would converge on Raven Bluff in a blizzard, because a substantial portion of Harrow Creek's population had spent the better part of 3 years making clear that they found Raven Bluff and its occupant not worth the effort of serious consideration. She was revising that assumption when the knock came. Not a hesitant knock, a fist against timber, hard and urgent. The knock of a person who has already decided that whatever's on the other side of this door is better than what is behind them. Eleanor set down her notebook and opened it. Sheriff Caleb Rourke stood in the entrance with ice across his shoulders and the beginnings of frostbite showing as white patches on both cheeks. He was in his full winter coat and his hat was still on his head, which told her he had not been outside long enough for the wind to take it, which meant he had left town recently, which meant he had waited longer than he should have before deciding to move. His horse was not visible, which meant he had left it or lost it. His eyes were the eyes of a man arriving somewhere he had never intended to arrive, and the expression in them was not shame and not gratitude. It was something more complicated than either. He did not speak. He stepped inside, and Eleanor stepped aside to let him. He stood in the center of the main chamber and turned slowly, taking in the full space the way a man takes in a landscape that contradicts his maps. His eyes moved across the reinforced ceiling, across the stacked and ordered shelves, across the stove and the lamp, and the sleeping child and the barrels and the carefully stacked wood, and Eleanor watched him absorb it. She watched the moment when the architecture of his thinking encountered a fact it could not accommodate without restructuring. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. His mouth was a flat line. "You built all of this yourself," he said. "There was no one else." He turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his face that was not quite an apology and not quite a question. It was the expression of a man who has been holding a position for a long time and has just felt the ground move under it. "I told you it would collapse," he said. "You did. I was wrong." He said it the way a man says something he has been carrying at some weight, not freely, but because it has become heavier than the carrying of it is worth. Then he moved to the wall beside the stove and sat down on the floor with his back against the stone, and he did not say anything else for a long time. The second knock came 11 minutes later, then a third, then 2 people together, a man and a woman, the woman clutching a bundled child against her chest, with the grip of someone who has decided she will not open her hands under any circumstances. Eleanor opened the door each time. She took a measure of each person as they came through, assessing for injuries the way she had been trained to assess cold exposure first, then structural damage, then the subtler signs of shock that presented in the eyes and the set of the jaw. By the time full dark had settled outside, 32 people occupied a space designed for fewer than half that number. Mayor Douglas Hatch arrived near the end, supported by Owen Price on one side. His coat was stiff with frozen rain, and his spectacles were cracked across one lens, and he had the slow, careful movements of a man whose body had been doing something very difficult for a while. He was conscious and oriented, which was more than she had briefly feared when she saw the state of him. Owen was shaking badly, his thin frame not built for what he had just come through, but his eyes were clear and his jaw was set with the determination of someone who has made a decision and has not yet finished executing it. Eleanor pulled Owen in first, checked his hands and face, determined the shaking was cold rather than damage, and put him beside the stove with a blanket. Then she turned to Hatch. He was standing in the middle of the chamber with his cracked spectacles and his ruined coat, and he was looking at her with an expression that contained several things at once, none of which resolved into anything simple. Eleanor did not have time to parse it. She checked his hands for frostbite, found early signs on the right, moved him toward warmth, made a note. On the other side of the chamber, Rourke was already on his feet, moving toward the doorway of the secondary chamber, with the quiet purposefulness of a man who has assessed the situation and identified what needs doing. He had not asked her what he should do. He had simply started doing what was evident. She noted this. It was useful. "Children and elderly in the back chamber," she said loud enough for the room. "Floor space in the main chamber for everyone else. Move carefully. There are supplies on every wall and they stay where they are." No one argued. What followed was the kind of collective adjustment that exhausted people make when they have been reduced by cold and fear to their essential cooperative instincts. Families reorganized themselves. The Anders children claimed a corner under their mother's direction. Agnes Ford set her tin box of store ledgers under her knees and sat on it with the composure of a woman who has decided to treat this as a temporary inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. The two railroad surveyors, both young men in their mid-20s, took positions near the entrance without being asked, which was either helpfulness or the territorial instinct of men who did not like having their backs to the door. Reverend Miles Cobb arrived near midnight after the first round of people had been fed, and the chamber had settled into its first tentative quiet. He was 60 years old and moved with the stiffness of a man who had been cold for too long, and when Eleanor opened the door for him, he came through without speaking. He stood inside the chamber and looked around at the people arranged on the floor and against the walls, and then he looked up at the ceiling, at the timber beams and the rock, and something moved across his face that Eleanor read as a man's private theology encountering an inconvenient fact. "This is no place for human beings," he said. He was not speaking to her specifically. It emerged as a statement of position rather than a criticism of hospitality. Eleanor was already back at her notebook. "There are blankets in the secondary chamber, Reverend. Take two." He took one and sat down against the wall near Agnes Ford and did not speak again for some time. By the third day, the chamber had become a world. Outside, the storm had not moderated. It had, if anything, deepened into something sustained and deliberate, a siege rather than an assault pressing against the bluff, with a consistency that was more unsettling than the dramatic violence of the first night. The sound inside was a low, continuous presence in the rock, not loud enough to prevent conversation, but constant enough that silence felt like something you had to maintain against it rather than simply inhabit. Eleanor had established the rhythms of the shelter on the first morning and enforced them with a consistency that left no room for negotiation. Meals twice a day, portioned by weight of person rather than preference, ladled from a central pot that she controlled. Water drawn from the seep in measured amounts, boiled before drinking. Wood added to the stove on a schedule she determined by feel and observation, maintaining a temperature in the main chamber that sustained life without wasting fuel. She moved through these tasks with the efficiency of someone for whom routine is not habit, but strategy. On the morning of the third day, Mayor Hatch stood up. He had been recovering steadily, the frostbite on his right hand responding to warmth and careful attention. He was still not the man who had presided over town meetings with comfortable authority, but he was functional, and function for Douglas Hatch apparently meant the resumption of certain instincts. "Mrs. Voss," he said, and his voice had recovered enough to carry across the chamber, "I want to propose a reorganization of the food distribution. Those with children and elderly dependents require greater caloric support to maintain care capacity." A differentiated ration system would be more equitable than a flat distribution. The chamber went quiet, not the quiet of agreement, the quiet of people who are watching something they are not sure how to interpret. Eleanor looked up from the pot she was stirring. Rourke spoke before she did. He was standing near the secondary chamber doorway, and he said it without raising his voice or adjusting his posture in the flat, straightforward register of someone stating a fact rather than making an argument. Mayor, she calculated these rations against the number of people and the estimated duration of the storm. If the distribution changes, the arithmetic changes. We may run short before the weather breaks. Hatch looked at Rourke. The two men were not enemies and had not been enemies, but they were not men who generally occupied the same side of a room, and something in the air between them acknowledged this. The arithmetic, Hatch said, can be recalculated. It can, Rourke said. She already did it, twice. Eleanor set down the ladle. The room was watching both of them, but she directed herself at Hatch, and she kept her voice at the same temperature as the stone wall behind her. At current rations, the stores last 27 days. At the distribution, you're proposing they last 19. This storm has been running 3 days. I have no way of knowing when it ends. If I had to choose between a system that keeps everyone alive for certain and a system that is theoretically more equitable, but leaves us short before the storm breaks, I will choose the first one without apology. The chamber was still. Hatch held her gaze for a moment. Then he sat back down. That evening, Eleanor was on the other side of the storage chamber when she heard the specific sound of wood moving against wood near the stove. She came back through the doorway in time to see Hatch leaning forward and transferring most of his dinner portion into the bowl of the youngest Anders child, a girl of perhaps 4 who had been crying on and off since the second night. He did it quietly, but not so quietly that the people nearest him could not see. It was an act of genuine generosity. It was also an act of theater, the kind of gift that knows it has an audience. Eleanor watched from the doorway. On the other side of the chamber, Rourke was watching too. Their eyes met briefly, and the look they exchanged lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and it contained more mutual understanding than any conversation they had yet managed. She returned to the storage chamber without comment. There was a man in there who needed his foot re-examined. On the 4th day, James Calloway began to cough. He was one of the 2 railroad surveyors, 26 years old, lean and healthy-looking, when he had come through the door 3 nights ago. The cough started as a dry irritation and progressed through the day towards something deeper and more productive. The specific wet sound that Eleanor associated with cold settled in the lower respiratory tract. She took his temperature by touch, assessed his color, noted the way he was holding himself against the discomfort. She needed willow bark tea maintained at steady heat, administered regularly. She moved toward the medical kit in the storage chamber and began setting up. Reverend Hobb materialized at her elbow. He had been more quiet since the first night, but not absent, and he had been watching her work with an attention she had noted and not addressed. "You're certain that helps," he said. It was less skeptical than his first night statement had been. The certainty had come out of it. What remained was a genuine question from a man who had spent decades operating in one explanatory system and was encountering the edges of it. "I am certain," she said, measuring bark into the water pot. "I used it on more than 200 men at Chickamauga. I know the dosage and I know the outcome." "And prayer," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not asking rhetorically," he said, and she realized he wasn't. "I intend to pray for him. I'm asking whether you see that as interference." It was not the question she had been expecting. She held it for a moment. "Do what you believe helps him," she said. "Just don't let it prevent you from giving him the tea when I hand it to you." Something in Cobb's face settled. He nodded once and he went to sit beside Calloway, and he began to speak quietly, and Eleanor went back to the fire, and for the next 2 hours, the two of them worked on the same man by entirely different means, and neither one stopped the other. Owen Price was sitting against the wall nearby watching all of it. He had been watching everything since the first night with a focused attention that reminded Eleanor of herself at a much younger age before she had learned that watching cost something and you had to be selective about what you spent it on. She saw him take out a small piece of folded paper from his coat and write something on it. She did not ask him what. By the 5th night, the storm had become something the people inside the chamber had stopped trying to measure against anything familiar. They had stopped asking how long, stopped comparing it to other storms they had known, stopped expecting it to behave like weather, and started treating it simply as the condition of the world. The way you treat a chronic illness, once you have accepted, it will not be resolved quickly. The sound in the rock was a constant low presence, and the chamber was warm enough to live in, and the food came twice a day, and this was what existence was. Eleanor did her work. On the fifth night after the last of the regular checks, and after the fire had been banked to its overnight setting, she took her lamp to the northwest corner of the main chamber and ran her hand along the ceiling beam above the storage shelf. She had been monitoring a small separation in the wood grain that she had first noticed on the third day of a stress fracture in the outer fibers of the beam that might mean nothing, or might mean the cumulative weight of snow accumulating on the mound above was beginning to exceed her engineering estimates. She held the lamp close and looked at it for a long time. In 17 years of building things designed to last against forces that wanted to destroy them, she had learned that the moment a problem announces itself is not the crisis. The crisis is what you decide to do in the following minutes while you are alone with the problem and no one else is yet aware it exists. The beam needed reinforcement. The only material available that could serve as a compression wedge was timber from the storage crates. 3 boards from the secondary supply chest would do it if cut and fitted correctly. Removing them would expose approximately 40 pounds of flour to the ambient moisture of the chamber, which was manageable if she rewrapped the sacks in the canvas she kept in the medical kit. She sat on the floor of the storage chamber for a while with her back against the cool stone and her lamp turned down to save oil. She opened her notebook to the last pages, the ones that were not temperature records. The names there were written in her careful handwriting, the ink older on some lines than others. Nathaniel, Clarissa. She did not read the sentences beside them. She did not need to. She had written them enough times that they lived in her hands now, rather than in her eyes. She sat with the names for a few minutes the way you sit with people who are no longer able to sit with you. Then she got up, found her tools in the dark, and went to work. She worked for 2 hours by lamplight, moving quietly, fitting the wedges into position with a precision that required more patience than strength. She transferred the flour sacks to canvas wrap, tied each one securely, restacked the crates against the east wall. When she was done, she ran her hand along the reinforced beam and felt it solid under her palm, the stress distributed into the rock the way she had designed the whole system to distribute stress through stone rather than through wood. She extinguished the lamp and went back to the main chamber. The stove was holding at its banked level, the orange glow visible through the cast iron vents. Most of the people were asleep or resting with their eyes closed. Rourke was not asleep. He was sitting against the south wall with his knees drawn up and his eyes on the stove, and he had clearly been awake for some time. He looked at her when she came through. She sat down against the opposite wall, and he looked at the lamp she was carrying, which was still slightly warm, and at the small wood shavings on her sleeve, and he put the information together without needing it, explained. "What time did you start?" he asked. "Late. You could have woken me. You would have tried to help." He looked at her steadily. "Would that have been a problem?" She thought about it. "Not with the work," she said. "But if I wake someone at 2 in the morning to help reinforce a beam, 32 people wake up afraid. If I do it quietly myself, 32 people sleep through a problem that has already been solved by the time they open their eyes." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm pressed steadily against the bluff. "My father built the house I grew up in," he said. It came out with the careful inflection of a man who does not often arrive at this kind of territory in conversation. "Log cabin, Missouri. He was proud of it. It was a good house." He paused. "It burned down when I was 12. 1 ember from the chimney, wrong wind, 40 minutes from first smoke to nothing left." Eleanor waited. "I've been telling myself ever since that you build solid and you stand firm and you face what's coming head on." He was looking at the stove, not at her. "That's what my father believed. That's what I believed." "Your father wasn't wrong to build solid," Eleanor said. "No, but he didn't think about the chimney." She looked at him for a moment. "The people who are most dangerous aren't the ones who build badly. They're the ones who build well and stop thinking." Rourke was quiet after that, and she did not push it. The fire held its low, steady warmth, and the rock held the chamber around them, and the storm kept its counsel outside. On the 7th day, Walter Crane came to find her in the storage chamber while she was reorganizing the remaining provisions. He was a broad-shouldered man of 45 who farmed the East Valley and who had, to Eleanor's knowledge, never said anything specific about her or her shelter, but had maintained a comfortable distance from both, which, in a small community, amounted to a form of participation in the consensus. He sat down on a crate with the deliberateness of a man who has been composing what he intends to say for some time. "I want you to know," he said, "that I bought extra flour in November. Enough to last my family 3 months. I was feeling good about that. He looked at his hands. I burned through half of it in 4 days, trying to keep the stove hot enough to survive. The cabin held temperature for about 6 hours in serious cold before I had to feed the fire again. I never thought about why. I just thought add more wood. Eleanor set down the sack she had been moving. Your walls, she said. What are they built from? Log. Good timber, well fitted. Thickness. 8 inches, maybe 10 at the base. She nodded once. Wood loses the fight over time. Stone has more mass. She stopped herself. She had said what was necessary. She did not elaborate. Crane sat with this. I thought solid meant heavy timber, he said, not going into the ground. Solid means mass that holds against temperature for longer than the emergency lasts, Eleanor said. That's what solid means. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man absorbing something that is rearranging other things it touches. Then he said, I told my wife when she heard about you moving into the Bluff that it was the saddest thing I'd seen. A woman so beat down by life that she went to live in the dirt. He said it without self-exoneration, just as a fact being reported. I'd like you to know I understand that was wrong. Eleanor looked at him. I know what people thought, she said. I wasn't beat down, I was paying attention. On the 9th day, the door opened one more time. Eleanor was at the far end of the storage chamber when she heard it, the specific protest of hinges being moved from outside, and then a sound that the hinges made when a person was leaning on the door rather than simply opening it. She came through to the main chamber and saw 2 of the men near the entrance pulling someone through, and the someone was Thomas Greer. He collapsed on the floor of the main chamber with the specific weight of a person who has used up everything they had getting to where they are. His coat was frozen solid across the back. His hands were bad. His face was the color of old paper, and his breathing was the shallow, rapid work of a body that had been in serious cold for a long time and was not sure it was finished. Eleanor came to her knees beside him without hesitation. She had seen this presentation before many times in places where the cold was a weapon rather than a weather condition, and she knew the sequence of what needed doing. She called for water that had been kept warm near the stove, called for the second blanket from the medical kit, directed the men helping her to support his head rather than his arms. She worked over him for more than an hour with the steady, unhurried focus that is the only thing that is genuinely useful when a person is balanced on the edge of the kind of cold that does not let go. He came back slowly. The room was not asleep. Most people were watching the way you watch something that reminds you how close the margins actually are. When Greer's eyes opened and stayed open and found enough focus to recognize where he was, the room let out a collective breath. He lay still for a while, looking up at the timber-reinforced ceiling. Then he turned his head and found Eleanor's face. I thought you were out of your mind, he said. His voice was rough and slow. I know, she said. She was wrapping his right hand carefully, her attention on the work. I charged you more. He said it plainly, no performance in it, too tired for anything but direct. Every time you came in the store, I charged you more than I should have, and then I told people about it like it was funny. Eleanor tied off the bandage. She reached for his left hand. And then I told everyone in town about how much you'd bought, he continued as if the words were coming out now simply because there was no longer any energy to keep them in. I made a joke out of it. I said you were either crazy or you knew something we didn't, and I let people laugh at the first half. The chamber was quiet, not performing quiet, actually quiet, the quiet of people who have found themselves inside a moment larger than ordinary conversation. You're going to be all right, Eleanor said, still working on his hand. The fingers are cold, but they'll come back. You need to stay warm and still for the next day. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him, not at his hands, at his face. When we get out of here, she said, charge fair prices. That's what I need from you. It was not forgiveness, and it was not absolution, and it was not the dismissal of what he had done. It was something more practical than any of those things. And in the silence of the chamber, where 32 people were listening, it landed as something heavier than comfort. She went back to the bandaging. What she did not tell Greer, what she did not tell anyone in that chamber on the 9th day, was what she had found the previous night on her second inspection of the ventilation system. The primary exhaust shaft, the one angled to carry smoke from the main chamber out through the north face of the bluff, had partially blocked. Not fully, not yet. But the ice accumulation in the upper section of the shaft had narrowed the opening to roughly half its design diameter, and the draft that had been moving reliably for 3 days was now moving at a reduced rate. She had tested it with a strip of cloth near the intake and noted the decrease. The stove was still drawing adequately for now, but if the storm continued and the ice built further, the situation would become serious in a way that would not announce itself gradually. She had sat with that information for 6 hours before she decided what needed to be done and who was capable of doing it. The answer to the second question was not reassuring. She had been carrying the problem of the ventilation shaft alone for 6 hours when she decided she could not carry it alone any longer. Not because she was afraid to act without consultation. She had acted without consultation for most of her adult life and did not find it burdensome. She was carrying it alone because the nature of the problem required a solution that involved another person's body going somewhere that other person's body might not survive, and she had learned in the long years since 1879 that decisions of that particular kind belonged to the person whose body was in question. She found Rourke awake before the others, sitting where he had taken to sitting in the early mornings, against the south wall with his back straight and his eyes on the stove. He had recovered fully from the frostbite on his cheeks, the skin still tight and slightly darker in patches, and he had the settled quality of a man who has found his function in a situation and is at peace with it. Eleanor sat down beside him and told him about the shaft. She told him simply, without drama, the way she reported anything that required a decision. Here is what I observed. Here is what it means. Here is the timeline. Here is what needs to be done. She told him that the shaft opening on the exterior face of the bluff was accessible from the mound above the main chamber, reachable by a person willing to climb in current conditions which were still severe. She told him that someone needed to go out and break the ice accumulation from the exterior opening using a wooden sounding rod she could prepare, and that the exposure time required was likely under 5 minutes if the person moved efficiently and knew exactly what they were doing before they went through the door. She told him the outside temperature was approximately 40 below with wind. She told him all of it, and when she was finished, she waited because this was the part that was not hers to decide. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He looked at the stove where the draft was still drawing, but drawing thin, the fire moving with a slightly labored quality that had been present for the last 4 hours. You were going to go yourself, he said. I was considering it, and you decided not to. I decided that if I don't come back, 32 people are in a worse position than if you don't come back. That's not sentiment, that's arithmetic. He looked at her then, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has spent his whole life being the person who makes the hard calculation, encountering someone who makes the same calculation, and arrives at a different answer about who is expendable. It was not comfortable for him. How long have you known about this, he asked. 6 hours. You let me sleep. There was nothing to be done in the dark that couldn't be done at first light. Waking you 6 hours early didn't change the shaft. He exhaled slowly, then he stood up. Tell me exactly what to do, he said. She told him. She had prepared the rod the previous night, a length of pine from the kindling stack, with the end shaped to a blunt point suitable for breaking compacted ice without damaging the shaft lining. She had cut the rope to the right length and already tied the loop at one end. She went through the procedure twice, not because she doubted his capability, but because precision at 40 below does not permit on-the-fly revision. Owen Price woke up while she was talking. He sat up from his place against the east wall and registered the rope in Rourke's hands and the set of Eleanor's face, and he said nothing, but she could see him making the calculation. I'll go, Owen said. Rourke looked at him. No, I'm lighter, easier to pull back. No, Rourke said again, and there was something in his voice that Owen recognized as a different register than the sheriff's usual authority. This was not an official no. It was the no of a man who has decided something and is not available for further discussion on the subject. Owen sat back. He watched. Eleanor helped Rourke into every layer available, packing the gaps with strips of canvas, wrapping his face until only his eyes showed. She checked the knot on the rope 3 times. She looked at him when she was done, the same steady look she gave everything she was about to trust with something important. The opening is 6 feet from the crest of the mound on the north side, she said. You'll feel it before you see it. Ice formation around the rim. 3 good strikes should clear it. Come back immediately. And if 3 strikes don't clear it, 4 strikes, she said. Something moved in his eyes above the canvas wrapping. It might have been the closest thing to humor either of them had permitted themselves in 9 days. He went through the door. Eleanor stood at the interior end of the rope with both hands wrapped around it. She had threaded it through the door frame rather than holding it at the door itself, which gave her better leverage and kept the door closed to near seal except for the rope's width. The cold that came through that gap was immediate and absolute, pressing against her face and hands like a physical presence. She counted. She had learned to count under pressure in field hospitals, where the count was the only thing that kept your hands working when your mind wanted to stop. She counted seconds now, tracking the rope in her hands for any signal, any change in tension that would tell her something had gone wrong. At 43 seconds, the rope went slack for a moment, and she tightened her grip and held, and then the tension came back and steadied. She kept counting. At 2 minutes and 11 seconds, she felt 3 sharp tugs in quick succession. She pulled. Rourke came back through the door with ice across his shoulders and ice in the fabric around his face, and his hands locked around the rod with a grip he was not immediately able to release. Eleanor got the door closed and got the canvas off his face and checked his hands before she checked anything else. His left hand was cold enough to concern her, but not damage the skin white, but still responsive when she pressed it. She put it between her own hands and held it there, applying pressure and warmth, and he let her do it without pulling away. The draft in the stove shifted within 4 minutes. She heard it before she saw it, the change in the fire's voice as the airflow normalized, the logs finding their draw, and the heat climbing back toward the level she needed it at. Around the chamber, people were beginning to wake. Most of them had slept through it. The ones who had been awake, Owen among them, had kept quiet in the way people keep quiet when they understand that what is happening requires concentration rather than audience. Rourke sat against the wall with his left hand still held between Eleanor's and looked at the stove. "Last time I rode up to Raven Bluff," he said, his voice still rough with cold, "I went to tell you that you were wrong. I remember. This time I went up to prove that you were right." He paused. "That's not nothing." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she released his hand, checked the color once more, determined it was recovering correctly, and stood up. "It's not nothing," she said, and she went to check on the morning rations. The 10th morning arrived without announcement. Eleanor was already awake when it happened, as she had been already awake for every significant change over the previous 10 days, sitting against the east wall with her notebook open and a lamp turned low. She noticed the change first in the sound, or rather in the absence of sound. The low, continuous pressure in the rock that had been the substrate of everything for 10 days was gone. Not diminished. Gone. She sat very still for a moment, testing the silence, not quite trusting it. Then she got up and went to the door. She opened it slowly. The brush screening the entrance had been pressed flat by the accumulated weight of the days, and beyond it the world was white and still and luminous, with the specific quality of light that follows a long storm. Everything clean and overbright, the shadows precise and blue against the snow. She stood in the entrance for a long time, looking at the valley below. Behind her, she heard people begin to stir. The sound of the door, the quality of the light coming through it, moved through the chamber and brought people upright from wherever they had been resting, and one by one, and then in small groups they came to where she was standing. 32 people crowded the entrance in the small space outside it and stood in the first morning after the storm. Nobody spoke for a while. The valley was unrecognizable in its transformation, the town half-buried roof lines sagging under the weight of 10 days of accumulation. Fences, invisible, the familiar landmarks of ordinary life, rearranged into a landscape that required relearning. Smoke was beginning to rise from a few surviving chimneys, thin and pale, climbing straight up in the windless air. The 33 of them stood in that cold, bright silence and took account. Eleanor was not looking at the town. She was looking north along the line of the road that ran toward the far end of the valley, toward the place where a bay horse stood tied to a fence post at the edge of a property she recognized as Harold Beecham's. The horse was alive, moving slightly against its tie, exhaling visible breath into the cold air. There was no smoke from Beecham's chimney. Rourke came to stand beside her. He followed her gaze. He did not say anything immediately. "He lives alone," Eleanor said. "Yes, he's too far north for anyone to have reached him." Rourke's voice was careful. "We don't know that." "No," she said, "we don't know that." But she knew. She knew the way she knew things that the body has already accepted before the mind has finished its argument, the way she had known the storm was coming when she pressed her hand to the ground on the road to her snare lines. She knew from the stillness of the property and the tied horse and the cold chimney and the specific silence of a place that has not had human movement in it for a long time. She stood with it for a moment. The cold morning air moved around her, gentle now, indifferent to what it had done. She had tried to warn Harold Beecham 7 years ago on the Dakota Plain, and she had failed, and 20 years of trail experience had been more convincing to him than her words, and 39 people had died in the snow. She had built her shelter and stocked it and prepared it partly in response to what Harold Beecham's certainty had cost her, and she could not now decide how to feel about the possibility that Harold Beecham had died in the same storm that her preparation had survived. Rourke sent 2 men north on the best available horses within the hour. Eleanor did not go with them. There were still 32 people who needed the transition from the shelter-managed, carefully frostbitten extremities that needed monitoring in the cold outside air, children who needed to be kept warm during the walk down to the town. She had work to do here, the work she had always had, and she did it. They found Harold Beecham in his barn 3 days later, when the snow had settled enough to allow access to the North Road. He had gone to his animals when the storm hit, covering them as best he could, and the cold had found him there. He was not far from his livestock. He had not been alone in the way that people who die in their beds are alone. But he was gone. Eleanor heard the news from Owen Price, who came to the Bluff the afternoon they brought Beecham back to town. Owen sat down on the rock outside the entrance and told her quietly, watching her face. She looked out at the valley for a long time. He was the one who told them to keep moving, Owen said, in 1879. Yes. Owen was quiet for a moment. He was 18 and he was learning how to sit with the complicated weight of events that do not resolve cleanly. Are you glad he's gone after what he did? Eleanor turned to look at him, and the look was steady and without performance. No, I'm not glad. She paused. I am sad for a man who spent his whole life being right and did not have enough time left to understand what it cost him. She turned back to the valley. And I am angry because he should have known there was somewhere to go. Nobody told him. That is, a failure of something. Owen wrote something in his small notebook. She did not ask what. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Eleanor's time at Harrow Creek. Stranger in their way than the 10 days in the shelter, because the 10 days had been comprehensible. Survival has a logic to it that organizes everything around a single clear objective. What came after was less organized and in some ways more demanding. People came to the Bluff, not in the frantic driven way they had come during the storm, but singly and in pairs on ordinary afternoons when the weather permitted, walking up the path that had been a dare for children and an embarrassment for adults, and was now something else, something without a name yet in the town's vocabulary. They came and they looked, and some of them asked questions, and some of them only looked, and Eleanor answered the questions that had answers and let the looking be what it needed to be. Walter Crane came twice before he said what he had come to say. On the second visit, he stood in the main chamber with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the ceiling beams for a long time. I want to understand how you decided on the spacing, he said finally. She showed him. She showed him the notebook entries from the construction period, the calculations for load distribution, the relationship between beam spacing and span that she had worked out partly from memory of things she had read and partly from experiment. She showed him the wedge system, demonstrated how the load transferred into the rock. She answered his questions precisely without elaboration, because she had learned that Crane was a man who received information better when it arrived in exact portions. How long did this take you, he asked. The design 1 winter, the build 3 years working around everything else. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. I've been building for 20 years, he said. I never once thought about the ground as a partner. I thought about it as a foundation to build on top of, something separate from the structure. Most people do, Eleanor said. Did you always think of it differently? She considered the honest answer. No, I thought of it differently after 1879. Before that, I thought the same as everyone else. Crane nodded again, and she could see him working something out, the way a carpenter works out a joint that has to carry a specific load, checking it from different angles. I'm going to build a storm room into the hillside behind my barn, he said. Not for living in, for the next time. The hillside faces which direction? South-southwest. That'll work, she said. Mayor Douglas Hatch did not come to the Bluff. He sent word instead through Owen Price that he wanted to meet her in town at her convenience. Eleanor considered the message for a day before she went, not because she was reluctant, but because she wanted to understand what the meeting was for before she decided how to approach it. She found Hatch in his office behind the town hall, a small room that contained a desk, 2 chairs, a stove, and the accumulated evidence of a man who administered things, papers, ledgers, a town map pinned to the wall with pencil notations. He stood when she came in, which surprised her slightly, and he gestured to the chair across from him, and she sat. He did not open with an apology. She had half expected one and had been prepared to redirect it, but Hatch was more precise than that. I want to discuss the shelter, he said. What you built, what it did, and what this town should learn from it. All right. I have been thinking about how to bring that knowledge into the town's planning in a way that people will actually act on. I have some ideas and I want your assessment of them. Eleanor looked at him across the desk. This was not the meeting she had been constructing in her mind on the walk down from the bluff. She had been prepared for contrition, for the performance of accountability, for the kind of meeting that is really about the person calling it. This was a different kind of meeting. Tell me your ideas, she said. He told her. He had a recommendation from the town council that each household develop a storm plan and identify a shelter location, a proposal to make building materials available at reduced cost for anyone constructing below-grade storm shelters, and a suggestion that Eleanor be formally consulted on construction designs for anyone who wanted her input. He presented them with the same directness he probably used in business negotiations, laying them on the table without ornament. Eleanor listened. Then she said, the first one will be ignored by most people. Print it anyway because the ones who act on it will need the social permission of an official recommendation. The second one will be used by about a third of the people who need it and will matter greatly to those people. The third one should not have my name attached. Hatch looked at her. Why not? Because there are still people in this town who will reject an idea that comes with my name on it out of habit. If you attach my name to the consultation process, some people won't use it. If you say the town council recommends experienced local builders consult on storm shelter design, the same people will come to me because I'm the person with the experience. Take my name off and leave the experience on. Hatch was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, following the logic. You're asking me to take credit you're owed. I'm asking you to make the process work, she said. The credit is not the point. He looked at her steadily. It should be the point. What you did deserves recognition. What I did keeps 32 people breathing, she said. That is the recognition. The rest is bookkeeping. He leaned back in his chair. Something in his posture changed, a slight release of whatever he had been holding ready for this conversation. You are a more practical person than I have been giving you credit for being, he said. It was not quite an apology. It was something more specific than an apology. It was a revision offered in plain language from a man who did not revise himself easily. And you, Eleanor said, are a faster learner than I expected. They came to an agreement in that small room without drama, without the theater of public reconciliation. The town council would issue its recommendations. The materials would be made available. The consultation would proceed under the rubric of experienced local expertise. Eleanor would be the expertise. Her name would appear in the record because she insisted on that one point, but not in the announcement. Hatch walked her to the door of the town hall when they were done. He held it open and she passed through, and he said to her back as she was leaving, "My wife told me something after we came out of the shelter. She said she thought you were the most prepared person she had ever seen and the loneliest." Eleanor stopped. She did not turn around. She wasn't wrong about the prepared part, she said, and walked back toward the bluff. Margaret Hatch came to visit 3 weeks after the storm on a clear afternoon when the valley was deep in snow, but the air had lost its killing edge. She brought a tin of shortbread, which she set on the shelf near the entrance, with the manner of someone who has decided to make an ordinary social call in an extraordinary place. And Eleanor made tea at the stove, and they sat on the sleeping platform in the main chamber, the way two women sit when they have arrived somewhere past the need for preamble. "I told Douglas something when we came out," Margaret said, "that you were prepared and lonely. He mentioned it. Was I wrong about the lonely part?" Eleanor held her cup with both hands. The stove was burning cleanly now. The draft fully restored the chamber at its steady temperature. "No," she said, "you weren't wrong. I have been watching you for 3 years from a distance," Margaret said, "because my husband spent 3 years watching you, and I am a person who pays attention to what my husband pays attention to. He was not watching you out of hostility." "I know," Eleanor said. "He was watching you the way a man watches something he can't stop thinking about." Margaret looked at her directly. "You frightened him. Not the shelter, not the strangeness of it. You frightened him because you were doing something alone that he couldn't imagine doing, and you weren't asking anyone for permission or help or recognition, and for a man who built everything he has by being the one people come to, that is a very uncomfortable thing to witness." Eleanor looked at her. "It doesn't seem like it should be." "No," Margaret said. "It doesn't. But men who have built themselves from nothing are sometimes the most fragile about their certainties because the certainties in the self are the same structure. You can't challenge one without the other feeling it. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and she was thinking about Harold Beecham, who had been another version of the same construction, certainty, and self built into one load-bearing unit, and about what happened to such structures when the weight exceeded their design. Your husband came around, she said. He did, Margaret said. He needed the right kind of pressure. She picked up her cup. You provided that. They sat together for a while longer, talking about practical things, about the town's plans, about the families who had been in the shelter and were doing well, and the ones who were doing less well. It was the first time Eleanor had sat with another woman in her own home since she had moved to Raven Bluff, and she was aware of this in the way you are aware of something you had stopped expecting and had therefore stopped missing. It was not painful, it was simply present. Margaret left before dark, walking carefully down the snow-packed path toward the valley. Eleanor stood at the entrance and watched her go. Owen Price appeared the following afternoon with his coat pockets full of questions and his notebook tucked under his arm as he generally appeared. He had been coming to the Bluff regularly since before the storm, but his visits had changed quality since the 10 days in the shelter. He was not a curious boy anymore in the way he had been. He was something more purposeful, moving toward a thing he had not yet named but could feel the shape of. He helped her carry a new supply of wood up from the valley because she had let the stock run low, and the restocking was genuine two-person work. And when they were done, he sat on the rock outside the entrance with his notebook and looked at the valley below. My father came to see the storm room I built behind our barn, he said. I heard. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand on the wall and stood there. Owen paused. I think that was him saying something. It was, Eleanor said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he took out the notebook and held it without opening it. I've been writing down everything I've seen you do for 2 years. Not the technical things, though I've written those too. The other things, how you think about problems, how you treat people who are rude to you, how you decide what matters. Eleanor looked at the notebook. May I see it? He handed it to her. She sat with it for several minutes, turning pages. He had written in a precise small hand, which she recognized as the handwriting of someone who had learned early that paper was a resource to be used carefully. He had drawn small diagrams alongside some entries, sketches of construction details accurate enough that she could recognize what they depicted. But most of the pages were what he had described observation, behavior, the patterns of a person's choices under pressure, documented with the quiet attention of a natural scientist. She closed it and handed it back. Keep writing, she said. I intend to, he tucked it under his arm. Reverend Cobb is going to mention the shelter in his sermon Sunday. He asked me what he should say, and I told him to talk about paying attention. That's the right answer. He didn't seem entirely sure about it. He'll find his way to it, Eleanor said. He's already further along than he was 10 days ago. Owen stood to go. He was halfway down the path when he stopped and turned. There are 2 babies born in the valley since the storm ended, he said. The Anders family and the Crane family. Both girls. He paused. Ruth Anders wants to name her daughter Eleanor. Something shifted in Eleanor's chest. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile. That's Ruth's decision, she said. She asked me to ask you if it would be all right. Eleanor looked out over the valley where the late afternoon sun was laying long shadows across the snow-covered rooftops, and the smoke was rising from the chimneys in the good straight lines of fires that were burning as they were supposed to burn in houses that were holding their warmth. It was still cold. It would be cold for months yet. But the cold was the ordinary cold of a Wyoming winter, which was not the cold of 10 days ago. It was the cold that the valley knew how to live with. Tell her yes, Eleanor said. Tell her I am honored. Owen nodded and continued down the path. Eleanor stood at the entrance to her shelter and watched the valley for a while longer. Spring was still months away, and the next winter was already in the practical part of her mind, a thing to be planned for. There would be new storm rooms to advise on new questions to answer, new calculations to run. There was work to do, as there had always been work to do, and she was not a person who found the prospect of work unwelcome. She went back inside and sat down by the stove with her leather notebook and opened it to the last page. Nathaniel's name was there. Clarissa's name was below it. The sentences beside them were faded now, written and rewritten over 7 years until the paper had taken the words into itself, and the ink was more memory than marking. She picked up her pen and added 2 new names at the bottom of the page, not below the others in the way of a list. Beside them in the way of company, Eleanor, and beneath it in her careful hand the second name she had been given without asking Stone. She looked at the names for a moment, then she set down the pen. Outside, the last of the afternoon light was going gold across the snow. On the mound above the chamber, and the bluff held the cold, the way it always held it steadily without complaint, with the patience of something that had been holding things for longer than any of the people who lived in its shadow could quite comprehend. The stove breathed its slow, even breath. The rock kept its temperature. The smoke rose from the vent shaft in a clean, straight line, visible for miles in the still winter air, a signal to anyone who knew to look for it that something warm was here, had always been here, and would be here when the next storm came. She closed the notebook, set it on the shelf beside the lamp, and began to prepare the evening fire.